Lecture 24, The End of History.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I indicated at the end of the last lecture, one reaction to the material that we've looked at in this course might be to say, well, it's all well and good, but hasn't it, in an important sense, now been superseded? The Soviet Union has collapsed. China, in a sense, is now only communist in name. Aren't we really faced with the triumph of liberal democracy, at least in those countries which are economically effective? Are they not either liberal democracies of one kind or another, or at least well on the way to becoming so? And doesn't this suggest that, interesting as the ideas discussed in the course may have been, they are, in a sense, not really very much to the point? These are challenging claims, and we're fortunate that they have been developed in a clear and powerful manner by an American scholar of Japanese extraction, Francis Fukuyama. Let us indeed explore them by way of a consideration of his ideas. In the summer of 1989, Francis Fukuyama published an article entitled "The End of History?" which was reflecting on the significance of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1992, he published a book called "The End of History and the Last Man," in which these issues were explored further. Who, though, is Francis Fukuyama? He's an American. He has a PhD in political science, and he's also an ex-State Department policy analyst and is now, in fact, a professor at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. What did he mean by the end of history? The key idea, I think, is that, on his account, liberal democracy is the final stage in political development. This, in a sense, is what everything has been leading up to. Its ideals, he would agree, are imperfectly realized, but he wants to argue that there are now no serious alternative ideals or programs. The notion of the end of history is to be found in the work of Friedrich Hegel, to whom we referred briefly when discussing Marxism. The idea is that history passes through various different forms of political organization until it reaches a final form beyond which there is nowhere else to go. Indeed, Fukuyama's argument is that the end of fascism, the collapse of authoritarian regimes, the collapse of the so-called Marxist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, in the end has left liberal democracy unchallenged. It's important, though, to note, first, that Fukuyama isn't claiming that all problems have been resolved. His argument, rather, is just that we must now look to resolving political and social problems within the framework of liberal democracy. He also stresses that there may be a range of different possible choices within liberal democracy, from American-style individualism on the one side through to Swedish social democracy on the other. Also, Fukuyama stresses that on his account, many countries are still, as he describes it, within history. What does he mean by this? Well, he says in many countries there is still ideological contestation. And indeed, in those countries there may be people who champion and support alternatives to liberal democracy. But, he wants to say, liberal democracy is the eventual endpoint for everyone. Why, one might ask, did Fukuyama take this view? Well, his opinion really was that you could see it as the culmination of several different tendencies. On the one side, he wanted to argue that there is, over history, a cumulative growth in scientific knowledge. I think he's not here wanting to champion anything particularly contentious, and certainly he's not wanting to get into disputes with Thomas Kuhn and other people who stress the element of discontinuity in science, but he wants to say, look, in science we really have something where knowledge can grow significantly over time. Secondly, he wanted to say that market-based economic organization clearly is superior to other economic alternatives, that in a sense, once one has got markets in place, once one has seen what they can produce, once one also sees what has happened when people have tried alternatives, there is also, in a way, no going back. Someone might say, okay, all well and good, but couldn't you have a different kind of combination of things, say, of markets combined with political authoritarianism? Indeed, someone might say, look at somewhere like Singapore, which looks a little bit like a market-based society, but where political power is very firmly in the hands of an elite. It looks a little bit like Plato's guardians running it and planning it. Fukuyama's view is really that while indeed there are such regimes, he thinks that in the longer term they're not stable. And in particular, he argued that in addition to well-being and so on, people also have a need for recognition. And he wanted to say that this is something which is properly satisfied by the formal rights that people have in democracies, but he wanted to claim it isn't properly satisfied in a situation where an elite are ruling, and in consequence he thought that Singapore-like arrangements, while they might work for a period of time, aren't in the longer term going to constitute a serious alternative to liberal democracy. In his book, he made some modifications to some of his initial claims, not least in the face of criticism. For example, he suggested that Japanese-style capitalism might offer, at least for Asian countries, an alternative to Western-style liberal democracy. What I guess is involved here is the way in which in Japan an attachment to large companies may play a rather different role in people's lives than an attachment to an employment by a large company does in Western countries. I guess it's an interesting and significant concession, but I'm not clear as to whether he would really want to make this point today. Why? Well, there's a sense in which, since he's written, the viability of Asian-style capitalism has looked sort of not quite so healthy. And one also might wonder whether over time, although this is clearly an empirical matter, people living in Asian countries might not in the end become as individualistic as are we. I don't know. His notion that there may be alternatives here is certainly a possible one. In his book also, he talked about the way in which the theme of recognition, which, as I've mentioned, plays an important role in his argument for why democracy, poses, according to him, some problems. First of all, he notes that some people on the left had argued that inequality is a problem for recognition within liberal democratic societies. In fact, you might recall, if you go back to our earlier arguments about socialism and discussion of moral arguments for socialism, that was a point that we raised there. Namely, some people from the left have said, well, there's a certain sense in which, for proper self-development, individuals need to be in a situation of equality, and some socialists have said, look, the kind of inequality that you get within capitalist societies doesn't really allow for proper development and proper recognition. Fukuyama discusses this, but he's somewhat skeptical about it. He also notes, though, that there have been some people on the right politically who've said that people have a need for heroism and also for superiority over others. Fukuyama takes this actually very seriously. I wasn't quite so sure why he found this so telling, or why, say, if people have got a particular need for it, it couldn't be satisfied by entrepreneurial activity, or, say, by the recognition of excellence in sports, or if you just simply want to see some people triumphing over others, you couldn't watch professional wrestling on TV. Fukuyama was aware that people might take issue with his views, and he tried in the book to anticipate criticism, and indeed in the book actually to answer some of the actual critics of his article. Let us look at some of the objections that he anticipated and his responses. First of all, one might ask, what about nationalism? Fukuyama argued that this really wouldn't be a long-term problem, that it had actually already been tamed in Western Europe and wasn't going to be a continuing problem. What, some people said, of Islamic politics? Here Fukuyama was very dismissive. He said, look, I don't actually think that it furnishes a coherent alternative to liberal democracy, and that it in a sense only looks impressive because of oil in the Middle East. I guess what he's saying here is it's something like the following. Suppose that you were running an art gallery, and a very rich potential donor came to see you. In those circumstances, you might pay a great deal of attention to his or her aesthetic opinions. Absent that money in the background, you would really say, this person just isn't worth listening to. And I guess this was Fukuyama's attitude towards Islamic politics, namely that people had been concerned with it and had taken it seriously, largely because of oil wealth. Next, someone might say, well, what about ecological issues and feminism? These, Fukuyama argues, aren't really offering alternatives to liberal democracy. Rather, they simply highlight problems that need to be resolved within liberal democracy. What also about other ideals? These, on his account, are to be handled within liberal democracy. Indeed, the model within liberalism of a kind of privatization of religion, that religion is something for the private sphere, you can pursue with other people in private these particular values. This, he says, is a model for how other kinds of values and attachments should be treated. How should we assess Fukuyama? What might we make of his work? He is surely making some striking claims, but he backtracks somewhat in the book. The book really isn't quite as startling as was his initial article. Rather here than offering my opinions, I'd like really to throw out some questions to you. First, one might ask, is it really the case that science, scientific knowledge, economics, and people's wish for recognition lead where he suggests? Are these things that really make a telling case for liberal democracy and rule out alternatives? Second, one might ask, are there at the moment, or are there possible alternatives to liberal democracy? Because clearly one thing to think about in relation to Fukuyama is, if you reject his argument, where else would you go? What alternatives might there be? Another kind of claim that can be made is really as to whether his analysis isn't possibly too Western-centered, or some critics have said, isn't it in a way too US-centered? For example, if we were in India, or if we were in China, or if we were in Colombia, what would his argument look like? Would it look as plausible if we were living there as it might do in, say, Western Europe or in the US? What also about international issues? Consider, say, the perspective of those who are not powerful, but who are suffering from or are likely to suffer from environmental problems. They may, say, be living in some island state where if the oceans are raising as a consequence of global warming, their prospects are really very poor. What are things going to look like from this kind of perspective, one which we discussed in the first of the lectures on ecological issues? Rather than continuing with such a list, or indeed offering my own responses, let me turn now to something rather different. Namely, we are now just about at the end of the course. Let me offer a few general reflections about the course. At one level, if the course has been successful, we certainly won't have resolved the issues that came up around the dinner table and so on. But I hope that it may now be a little clearer what is at issue when such disagreements arise and when such discussions take place. We may also, I hope, have become a little more aware of some of the problems that other people may be able to raise about our own views. Something indeed which I think is an important part of our own self-development. At the same time, as the course may have suggested, every view typically faces some problems, indeed sometimes some quite difficult problems, ideas which it is interesting to grapple with. Indeed, one shouldn't think that because there are difficulties facing your view, that is grounds just for giving it up. One of the intellectual adventures in life is indeed seeing how problems about the views to which you're attracted might be tackled. And I hope from this point of view that the course has given you something to think about. Let me now, however, make use of Fukuyama and his views as a point from which we can then look back at the course. What might people who hold some of the different views that we've examined make of his claims? First of all, let's take both welfare and classical liberals. I guess their reaction would typically be to say, first of all, yes, we don't actually disagree with Fukuyama's broad picture of things. We certainly don't think that there is any better alternative than liberalism. However, each of them would say what is actually crucial is which interpretation of liberalism you take up, which interpretation of freedom you take up, which conception of rights you take up. There are also going to be issues about how we interpret the democracy side of liberal democracy and about how that relates to liberalism. Indeed, this, as I think we have seen from earlier lectures, is a topic which is still a very live one for argument. What about conservatives? Well, I guess conservatives would say that they fully agree with Fukuyama about the bankruptcy of socialism and the bankruptcy of authoritarianism. But I guess that they would argue that he has not appreciated the kind of moral and social crisis into which, in their view, liberalism has led us. Clearly, from a conservative perspective, we can't rest simply with liberal democracy. There are, from this perspective, issues both about morality, but about how the substance of society is going to work that have vitally to be addressed. And if you don't do that, then they would be likely to say that you can't really be all that optimistic about what's going to happen within liberal democracy. Similarly, but from a rather different perspective, left-wing communitarians will object to his picture of a triumph of liberalism. And they also are likely to argue that a very different way of doing things is going to be needed from what has become traditional within liberalism. Community needs to be our concern, they would argue. Libertarians also are going to be a bit unhappy. Fukuyama's liberalism, for them, is much too statist in its character. What does this mean? Well, for example, the democracy that he favors is, from their perspective, collectivist. It makes the individual, to much too great a degree, open to the opinions of majorities of other people. From a libertarian perspective, a good society is one in which people can make decisions for themselves, rather than, as it were, being linked up to lots of other people and chained up to them and to collective decisions that they may make. Many of those concerned about social capital will argue, as will communitarians, that within liberal democracy some things are going badly wrong. They would, I think, agree that we must work within a liberal democratic framework, but they would argue that in this work Fukuyama doesn't really address some of the key issues about what makes for a good society. In this context, actually, two interesting points are worth noting. It was striking that early in 2001, there seemed to be a kind of coming together of some of those interested in social capital and community, including people whom one would not have thought of as being, say, particularly sympathetic to conservatism, around President George W. Bush's ideas about the government working through religious organizations in the field of social service. The second comment in this area is that it's worth noting that after Fukuyama published the work with which we've been concerned here, he went on to write a book on the topic of trust. And in this, he himself allied his approach very much to that of Putnam, but Fukuyama took a somewhat conservative interpretation of what the problems are concerning community. His own view was that one of the issues that causes a problem isn't just the expansion of government, but it's also some aspects of commercial activity, and Fukuyama himself in this area allied in some ways with those people who are stressing the significance of social capital. What about other reactions? Many of those concerned about environmental issues are likely to reject Fukuyama's ideas completely. Fukuyama, if you recall, effectively said that environmental issues are simply something that has to be tackled within liberal democracy. They, by way of contrast, would argue that the vision of the end of history that he is offering is one which actually isn't sustainable, because they want to argue that if one takes liberal democracy, understood as the Western pattern, as not only something that's supposed to continue, but actually to be a model for everyone, then one is going to face major problems. Because they wish to argue that there are severe environmental constraints on our ability to run societies like ours, and indeed deep ecologists would argue too that there are value-related problems too that haven't been properly thought out. And accordingly, people who take ecological issues seriously are likely to argue that Fukuyama's views are superficial, and that in a sense in the area of ecology there are problems which, if ignored, will bring liberal democracy to an end. Socialists too would reject his approach. Almost all socialists, including Marxists now, would, I think, repudiate the view that the Soviet Union had anything much to do with what they mean by socialism. They would instead include social ownership, a good measure of material equality, and democratic control as being at the heart of their socialist vision. And they would stress that their concern is with the well-being, or for the well-being, of everyone, for the vulnerable in our own societies, and also for those people who are suffering and unfortunate elsewhere. Liberal democracy, they would say, is just another name for business as usual, and the continuation of the very kinds of things of which they are critical. And what's more, and go back to our analysis of socialism, their claim is that these things are immoral, that our ways of doing things at the moment, while they may seem to us okay, are immoral, and they would take that view of Fukuyama's conception of liberal democracy. Feminists have many different voices. Indeed, I guess you could actually fill a lecture series of this kind with contrasting feminist perspectives. But they would surely argue that issues that feminism has raised should really prompt us into a quite radical rethinking of how society should be organized, and also of how we should think about ourselves. Recall in this context the ideas about the need to rethink the notion of a liberal individual, of whether a liberal individual wasn't just another word for man, and of whether we shouldn't consider both different ideals but different aspirations and stages in life when thinking about political matters. If, I guess they would say, this all can be done within what Fukuyama calls liberal democracy, well, all well and good, but this may then simply show that Fukuyama's notion of liberal democracy is a little bit general and vague. That's to say, its all-compassing character may effectively indicate that it's too unspecific to say anything very much about politics. Otherwise, feminists may say, our ideas about both liberalism and democracy, the two different conceptions that are forged together in Fukuyama's view, may both stand in need of a systematic reworking. Nationalists would, I think, argue that nationalism, rather than being something like a kind of infant disease, something that particular polities may have when they're young, but which they then grow out of as they get mature and turn just into liberal democracies, they would say no. Our ideas are now very much alive, and indeed that they are now coming very much into their own, even in Western Europe. And indeed, they might say that the development of the European community and the development of globalization has, by way of a kind of reaction, also led to a strengthening of people's concerns with cultural and with national identity. They could point in this context, for example, to Scotland. Scotland has been a part of the United Kingdom for really a good long while. It has now been granted, with a great deal of popular support, a good measure of political autonomy, and round this there has been a quite strong rallying of concern for things that are distinctive about Scotland as opposed to England. There has been a revitalization of concerns for a distinctive Scottish cultural identity, and indeed this is linked too, in some ways, to some people wishing to push for a greater degree of autonomy in Scotland within the EC for self-government. Those concerned too with identity politics would argue, I think, as do feminists, that Fukuyama's conception of liberal democracy is really much too general a term. If it means the kind of arrangements that we've had up till now, then, in their view, it requires radical rethinking. Alternatively, if liberal democracy really amounts to a framework within which such things as identity-based politics can be accommodated, then, all to the good, but there is a risk that it may become so general as not really to be all that informative. So, one might ask, where does this leave us? Well, first, I hope stimulated. It has been immensely interesting for me to work through this material, and all I can say quite genuinely on that score is that I hope that you've enjoyed working with me on it as much as I have preparing it and delivering it. I also suspect, though, that you may have been left in some ways rather frustrated by the course. Clearly, I've had to make selections as to what we will have looked at. And by this point, you're also likely to have become all too aware of the limitations of my own perspective on the material and may wish to take issue with my judgments and my approach. If you do, don't hesitate to write to me. But actually, that you may have been provoked in this way is exactly the point of a course like this. That's to say, that my hope is that through dialogue about a range of material, you are led to develop your own interests, perspectives, and concerns. I'm also, though, very much struck by just how much has been left out. I've consciously taken a Western perspective, and so we have treated only in passing issues that are of prime concern to people elsewhere. I've also focused largely on issues of domestic politics, and matters indeed may look rather different if one takes a global political perspective. There are also all kinds of questions, not least ideas about how democracy might be understood, that I've dealt with very much in passing. But all these simply indicate further and exciting possibilities that might be explored in future courses of lectures. Thank you very much for joining me in this one.
We hope you've enjoyed these lectures from our Great Courses series. Our courses are now available to order online. Visit our website at www.teachco.com or call our customer service representatives at 1-800-TEACH-12. That's 1-800-832-2412. Thank you.